So, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Selena Carty from BlackPoppyRose, who worked so hard to help us with the Lest We Forget exhibition that we've got on at the moment. So with that, thank you very much, and over to you, Selena.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this Thursday evening. It's the 1st of February, and it's the first day of Black History Month over in North America. So that's for North America, Canada, and the West Indies. And we also look at the connectivity between the African American history that can be found here in England. So that's where we are today. But lest we forget, is the idea is for me to take you on a journey from the 1700s to today and to explore the themes around Black, African, West Indian, Pacific Island, and Indigenous nations' contributions to war. So we can start looking at some of the common themes, common narratives, and the impact of service. Because when we look at war, it's about serving our families, our nations, our countries, irrespective of where we are in the world, and looking at how we come together as an empire or a former empire, and that relationship between all of our services and how we can create that ongoing narrative around the visibility. And in 2024, we're celebrating 110 years for the start of World War I, 80 years for D-Day, so the landing of the Allies in France on the 6th of June. We're also looking at the 120th anniversary of the Berlin Conference, which is where European powers divided up the continent of Africa amongst themselves to continue to expand empire. So I'm going to cover a variety of themes this evening. I'm hoping that I don't speak too fast, but I'm going to cover a variety of themes this evening to kind of give you a timeline and understanding of how we are contributing and how we are coming together to be able to serve. So we are going to start with what's been passed on every 100 years. So my role in life is that I'm a cultural and ancestral genealogist. So I help people to trace their family ancestry, irrespective of where you are in the world, looking at names, places, migration, and culture, and looking at how that connectivity between family and culture changes throughout generations, changes throughout movement, changes throughout where you find yourselves in the world. But the most common things that we can, I hope, agree that we pass on every 100 years is recipes, advice, memories, assets, trauma, inheritance, ideas and concepts, names, land, conditioning, pain, confusion, blueprints, frameworks, precious items, and history and heritage. And all of these listed mean different things to different people at different times and different places in the world. So the idea is, how do we find that commonality between all of these bullet points in our communities and in our narratives? I also like to start off with the worldview. So why does, a third of the world speak English? And when we look at the circumnavigation, yes, of Europeans in the 1400s, we look at the expansion of the empires around the world. So America used to be a colony of Britain. So did parts of Canada, continent areas on the continent of Africa, as well as Germany when they lost their regions that they were given in the Berlin Conference after the First World War. They were given to England to look after as custodians. We also look at India and parts of Asia and China and Australasia when I was growing up at school, but Oceania today, New Zealand and Tasmania, and other small islands like Fiji and Tonga, which again was taken over by the Germans and again given to Britain to look after. But this is what we're looking at, where in the world we're coming from. And on the continent of South Africa, we have South America, we have British Guyana, which is a part of the West Indies as a grouping, but it's a part of the South American continent, and looking at the men and women who have served and come from these regions and served within the economical frameworks, within the resource framework, and within the labor framework from the 1700s going forward. So I hope you're familiar with these three faces. We have on the left Gustavus Vassa or Olaudah Equiano. We have in the middle William Wilberforce and Ignatius Sancho. These three men were pivotal with their roles that they played within the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, which came into existence in 1807. But what many people don't know is that Olaudah Equiano on the left, he served in the 7-Year Wars when the 7-Year Wars took place in the North Americas between 1756 to 1763. His service aboard ships during this war empowered his understanding and his drive to liberate other Africans at the same time during this time period. So when he got back to England and bought his freedom, he was pivotal in creating an organization called the Sons of Africa, which was the first Black liberation group to be noted in this country, and their efforts to be able to fight against the Slave Trade Act and fight for the Black voice, Black liberty in this country. William Wilberforce was pivotal in that. So we remember him as being the liberator and one of the strongest forces with the Abolition Act. And the man on the end, his name is Ignatius Sancho. In the latter part of the 1700s, he became the first Black man to vote in this country. And this was because he was left money in the will of the Montague family, of which he worked for. He was able to take that dividends and buy a business. So he had a greengrocer's business, and he also had capital. So as a result, he was a part of the 5% of this country of white men who could vote, which then historically gave him acclamation to be able to vote. Last December, they unveiled a plaque in Westminster Abbey to commemorate his life here and the marriage to his wife in the 1700s. So now we have an additional bit of Black history in Westminster Abbey, which signifies this time period. But we look at the 1700s and the wars and the expansion of Britain, and look at the contributions made and the voices, so that when we're going through time, we start to look at the themes of the voices that continue to find themselves in the forefront to be able to make and create the change in regards to service. King George III and Queen Charlotte Sophia of Mecklenburg-Strelitz were the king and queen of America. And then once we have the American Revolution, we have George Washington becoming America's first president. So we're going through a timeline, a genealogical timeline of the kings and queens of this country, and looking at the relationship and the inheritance of the expansion of empire and the service of those who were a part of that empire. So this is an image from the American Revolution, and I hope you can see the African who wasn't classified as an African American then, because nobody was, but being very much a part of this war and the war efforts, because Africans were in America during this time period, and they served on both sides of the wars, as they did in the American Civil War. But we have imagery, we have writings, we have publications about these contributions and how they are very integral to the history around service, and the reason why it's important that we do not forget. After Britain lost the American colony, they needed to mobilize men in that region of the world to be able to fight against the uprisings in the West Indies and in aspects and in areas of America that they still owned. So they formed the West India Regiment in 1795. The West India Regiment was formed of the 1st South Carolina Regiment in America. They were sent over to Jamaica, of which they then mobilized men in Jamaica and from Barbados together to form the 1st West India Regiment. There ended up being 12 regiments from 1795, where they became disbanded in 1928, I believe, after the First World War. But they became amalgamated to become just the West India Regiment. So there were no longer 1st and 2nd. It was just West India Regiment. And we have artifacts, a part of our exhibition. And one of these can be found in the exhibition with you all in Wiltshire. But a lot of these artifacts were made in Birmingham and in London by organizations such as Firmin. So Firmin still create the military official uniforms and artifacts and the hat badges and shoulder badges and helmet plates for the British armies today, as well as Gaunt Limited, which can be found in London. They were founded, Firmin history goes back to 1655, and Firmin was founded in 1899, and they were very pivotal in creating the symbolisms and the artistic artifacts for the West African Frontier Force, for the King African Rifles, for the Maori Pioneers, for the British West Indies Regiment, for the West India Regiment. And at the back of all of the artifacts, there are their stamps, so that you're able to see who has created them. But these are some of the buttons, shoulder badges, and cap badges that are in our collection that had been created for the West India Regiment. It's also important to note the expansionism of the empire and why people served. Because if you take a look in the left corners of all of the flags, you see the Union Jack. So we didn't get the Union Jack until the 1700s with the unification of Britain and Scotland. And then that's where we get the formation of the Union Jack. And as the empire, Great Britain, expanded, the flags continue to multiply. And as you can see, you can see the entire empire, which is including of the colonies and the dominions. So the dominions would include Canada, India, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. The rest would have been classified as colonies. So when we're looking at the men and women who served, they were coming from all over the world and all of these regions. 1803 to 1815, we have the Napoleonic Wars. And if you are familiar with London, familiar with Trafalgar Square, you know we have Nelson's Column. Aboard Nelson's Column, we have this plaque. At the bottom, it said, England expects every man will do his duty. And if you can see that I've circled the African face, his name is George Ryan. And in books and literature, he is noted to being an African from the continent of Africa, but we're not sure where exactly in Africa he's coming from. But again, this what's the word? Plaque depicts the diversity of the nation and diversity of the time and the service made by men from all over the empire. Queen Victoria, during her reign, we have the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, and these are our most famous nurses, Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole. So again, we're looking at service from the 1700s, 1800s, and look at the faces and the global reach, because Mary Seacole's coming from Jamaica. Her father was Scottish. Her mother was an African brought to the West Indies. And as a result of that, we're looking at the diversity around the contributions and the understanding of service based on being in these parts of the world. So British Jamaica saw and understood that Britain was their mother country, and anytime there was any need to serve, they would gladly serve. And same with West Africans, East Africans, South Africans. 1884 to 85, we have the Berlin Conference, or we have the division of Africa. There were no African nations at this meeting, only Europeans, and the Americas were invited as a courtesy. But Europeans were tired, so this is England, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Belgium. They wanted to ensure that they created the necessary borders between the regions that they were occupying on the continent of Africa, and to prevent more warfare and upset. And Otto von Bismarck, at the time the Chancellor of Germany, he had consolidated Germany into a stronger empire and felt that he should have more access to the global reach that France and Britain had. And as they were dividing Africa, had hoped that they too would be able to get a greater portion of the continent, but that didn't take place. But that's another talk. At the Berlin Conference, we have empires that had existed and nations and communities that had existed and had already had names before we get the names such as Nigeria and Ghana or the Gold Coast, Liberia, things like that. And we look at the maps and look at the changes and look at the impacts of that and impacts of the nations, communities, their service fighting internally, as well as on the global war fronts and the global battle fronts during World War I and World War II. So if you look at this map, this is without European occupation, and then with European occupation. So all of the regions that were formerly isolated within their own nations, empires, were now put together under one to serve under European powers. So France had a great portion of North and West Africa. Britain had a great portion of Africa throughout the continent. And this is where they were able to mobilize men, because they found through the West Indies that sending European men to climates that they were unfamiliar with was costing them their lives. And as a result, they needed to mobilize men on the ground to be able to fight against any enemy based on the borders being created, to prevent them from destroying the infrastructure, the railways, the telecommunications, the crops that had been disseminated and decided that where they would grow based on trade, cotton, things like that. So this is now what Africa had looked like after the Berlin Conference and the occupations of Europeans. So this is another aspect of history to understand why service was seen in the way that many Africans saw it in regards to serving nation, king, queen, country. Same with the West Indies, the occupation. So in the yellow, you have the UK. So where we have the British West Indies Regiment being formed from men from over 12 islands in the West Indies. The same with the French regions, and looking at the middle of Central America, where we have former British Honduras, which today we call Belize, where Britain were also able to mobilize men from those regions into the West India Regiment and into the British West Indies Regiment. So this is our geography lesson to be able to take us around the world to see where men would have been coming from the Black and African and West Indian regions. This was also the same formula in India and in Asia, in parts of China and other areas of Asia. So I've shown you King George III, I've shown you Queen Victoria, and now we get to King George V, who we are predominantly most familiar with. So World War I started in 1914 under the reign of King George V. And the first shot fired during World War I was fired by this man right here, Al-Haji Grushi, coming from the northern regions of the Gold Coast, which we now know today as Ghana. He fired the first shot, World War I, in August of 1914. And again, this is history that we continue to keep talking about, because when we were all growing up, this wasn't history that was very much readily available, even though we know so much about the First World War. These are some of the artifacts for the West African Frontier Force. The West African Frontier Force in the 1920s, I think it's 1928, was officially given a royal patronage, of which they became the Royal West African Frontier Force. So an R was put at the front of the WAFF, and all the memorabilia and the I call them memorabilia because I live for them, I love them. They were rebranded and they were recreated. So whenever you see items like this, they are another way to be able to talk about history pre-1928, because they only existed until that day, and then the Royal West African Frontier Force existed after. And if you make note of some of the artifacts, you have the NNR, that was Northern Nigeria Regiment. We have the SNR, Southern Nigeria Regiment, because until 1914 there was no unified Nigeria. It was Northern Nigeria, it was Southern Nigeria. And again, that amalgamation came in 1914 and again created its own internal warfare. And we have the Gold Coast Regiment, GCR, Gold Coast Regiment, and the First West African Frontier Force. Again, looking at the building blocks for the West African Frontier Force, started from the West Africa regiments, which were founded on the Mende and the Too Many People of Sierra Leone in 1898. But they felt that it was needed to mobilize men from Nigeria, Northern and Southern Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Gambia, and Sierra Leone into a new regiment to be able to fight in a different way. So that's some of our lovely artifacts. So moving through that, we start to look at service for Britain and the impacts of those who served for Britain. So we have Arthur Roberts, Walter Tully, and Thomas Tully, all born in the UK. They had fathers coming from the West Indies and mothers being born in England, and we call them COTW, a child of two worlds. So looking at their impact and their upbringing here, Arthur Roberts served for Scotland. Walter Tull is noted being the first Black professional football player for Tottenham Hotspurs. He served in one of the Middlesex regiments. And we have Thomas Tully, who served in the Royal Flying Corps. He was from Islington. Walter Tull was coming from Kent, and Arthur Roberts, although born in Bristol, served in Scotland. But these are men who were born in this country and served for this country. We have the African Americans. We have Henry Johnson, Eugene Bullard, and James Reese Europe. So James Reese Europe and Henry Johnson served for the 369th Infantry, which was also nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters, and they were sent to France to serve with the French army. In the middle, we have Eugene Bullard, who became the first Black African-American pilot for France. He served with the French Foreign Legion during World War I, and all three of them have been noted in history for their gallantry, for their efforts, and for their service, not only for a country that did not appreciate their service and sent them to France and sent memos to France of how to be treated, because they didn't want them to be confused that they would be treated any better just because they had served on their return home. But again, that's another presentation. We have the Canadians. So we have Reverend William White, Sam Morgan, and Albert Carty. My name's Selena Carty, and Albert Carty's descendants have adopted me into their family to be able to talk about their story and their contributions to the war. But these three men served in the number 2 Construction Battalion, which was an all-black battalion coming from Nova Scotia in Canada, coming over to England and France and throughout Europe, serving with the Canadian Lumber Forces, cutting down trees and being integral in consolidating timber for the war efforts during World War I. We have doctors. So doctors were official. It was official that doctors were put into position of captain when they enlisted. Dr. James Risson Russell, he was coming from British Guyana. He got his doctorate at Edinburgh University. So he studied here in the 1800s. He is one of the pioneers in neurology and shell shock. So he was collecting data during the First World War to help the men coming back from war who were dealing with shell shock. And a lot of the work that he developed became pivotal in medical paperwork, medical journals, and medical conferences. Dr. John Alcindor is coming from Grenada. He was rejected from becoming a doctor in the Royal Medical Corps because of the tone of his skin. However, he established a doctor's practice in Paddington in London and was looking after the servicemen who came back from war. The same for Dr. Irving Bass from Richmond, Virginia, in America. Although he did not leave America, he was a doctor within the army, within America, and serviced many of the men coming back from war. Jamaica. I am a Jamaican, British-born Jamaican. But these three Jamaicans left Jamaica to come and serve in England. So William Clark served in the Royal Flying Corps. Norman Manley was here. He was the first Premier of Jamaica. He was here studying at Oxford University. He joined the London Field Artilleries, him and his brother. His brother, Roy Manley, did not make it back from the war. He is buried in Lissenhoek in Belgium. But Norman Manley came back from the war and continued his studies and went back with that experience from the war and his education to go back and liberate Jamaica to freedom in 1962. George B. Mudd also came from Jamaica. He was here studying in the London School of Economics. He also served in London Field Artillery, but he also died in Europe during the First World War. But again, they were coming to serve for their mother countries and also coming to be educated based on what was available here and take that back to liberate their communities in the West Indies. I also talk about the Pacific Islands and the indigenous nations. So you have Ratu Sukunya. He also was at Oxford University. He was coming from Fiji. We have Alfred Cameron from Australia and Francis Pega Magabao from the Canadian First Nations. And when we go through the history, if you see a surname like Cameron, would you associate that with somebody who is seen as an Aboriginal or an Indigenous person from the Australias? But if you saw Sakuna or you saw Pega Magabao, you would know that these are men coming from Indigenous backgrounds and again are a part of the war efforts and their service and wanting to serve for their nations. We have other men coming from other parts of the empire. So we have soldiers coming from Germany. And if you look at the helmet plate on his head, it's of the eagle with a widespread wings, which was one of the symbolisms for Germany. You also have Marcel Palat for Russia. He served for Russia in the naval forces. And you have a man called Ali Selkten. He was serving for the Ottoman Empire in World War I. He also served as an aviator, and he also served in the, sorry, give me one second. And he also served for Turkey during World War II. Additional to those men who served, we have men serving from the continent of Africa, serving for France, Germany, and Britain. We have Ibrahim Dina Salafu serving for the Nalu people of Guinea. His father was very famous in France because of his service in Guinea and because of the relationship that he had built with his nation for his nation in France. This is also connected to a man called Blaise Diagne, who was the first Black man to be elected into the French Parliament. He was responsible for mobilizing men in the Senegalese Taraïa who served during World War I, as well as providing liberation for many of the African regions in the French colonies during this time period. We have the King of Kong of Cameroon. He is dressed in the German uniform. He also was a considerable symbol for his people to be able to support the German war efforts during this time period. And we have Regimental Sergeant Major Bilo Akure from Nigeria. He also served in the West African Frontier Force and was afforded the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the military medals for his service during World War I. So these are a few faces of the men whose names we know, of some of their stories, to be able to bring them forward. We have the West African Frontier Force, as I mentioned before. We have the King African Rifles coming from East Africa, serving from Nyasaland, which is today Malawi, British East African Protectorate, which today is Kenya, Somaliland, and Tanzania, and Zanzibar. We have the British West Indies Regiment, who saw battle on all of the battlefronts during World War I. We have the South African Native Labour Corps, the Fiji Labour Corps, and as you can see in the first image, I hope you can see King George V inspecting the South African Native Labour Corps, and again inspecting the Fijian Labour Corps. Here is King George V again. We also have the Maori Pioneer Battalion. So this is showing you the global reach of the empire and the contributions made by men by many men during World War I.
Mommy, can I have a quiz?
Give me 1 second, please.
Right, Mommy. Mommy, look at this.
My apologies. Motherhood is always great. King George V was our monarch during World War II. So I hope that you've been able to see the legacy that has been built and been built upon. Where was the first shot fired? I'm going to answer that shortly. The timeline of service of the heads of our nations being leaders during these war efforts, and if you could give me, I just need to sort my daughter out.
I'm sure we all understand the challenges that come from a young family. So a reminder, if you want to ask a question, as Malcolm has while Selena's talking, you can use the Q&A button, and we'll come back to that after Selena's finished and after she's finished with her daughter.
Right, now I can focus.
She's all sorted, is she?
I hope so.
Fingers crossed.
Right, so the timeline from the 1700s, so that's 200 years. From the 1700s, well, it's not quite 200 years because the latter part of the 1700s, but 1700, 1800, we're looking at service globally, worldwide, and the impacts that the wars have had on the entire world, and why Black, African, West Indian, Pacific Island, indigenous nations are a part of these wars and a part of these narratives. Now, I didn't write any of the books, I didn't make any of the artifacts, I didn't create any of the pictures, but what's happened is by looking at history from a global perspective, I've been able to help to fill in a lot of the gaps that have been missing for years, especially my education, and I'm sure in many other people's educations, to be able to kind of give a wider overview of the importance of collective remembrance. So now when we get to World War II, this is more familiar to a lot of us because we still have living ancestors who were connected to this, who have memories of either being impacted by the air raids in this country, or the air raids in the West Indies, or the rationing and the fundraising in Nigeria, or all over the world. We were all impacted and we were all brought together to do something to fight against fascism. So again, we have the descendants of King George V, Queen Victoria, and King George III and Queen Charlotte, and their family lineage of their contributions and their service to the nations and to the empire. The posters, the British Commonwealth of Nations together. The British Commonwealth and its allies will destroy the Nazi tyranny. And a lot of these images and a lot of the promotional campaigns was about that collectiveness that we have from World War One, also bringing into World War Two. But we have the ATS, we have the Auxiliary Territorial Service. So we have West Indian women coming from the West Indies to England. We also have them going to America and also working throughout the West Indies, providing services for the war efforts. We have women like Lance Corporal Kathleen Walker from the Australian Women's Auxiliary Service. We have Second Officer Kalyani Sen from the Women's Royal Indian Naval Services. We have Corporal Lillian Bader for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And all of these three women have phenomenal stories and stories that will inspire around their choices for serving and the impacts that the visibility of seeing them in uniform, seeing them doing something to fight against what their men were being sent to fight against, because it was a common theme that when the men left in World War One, women were doing every single job, and they were seen to be a benefit to our nation as we are. But looking at how women were pivotal in a lot of the behind the scenes roles during the Second World War, because it wasn't ideal for men to send women to the war front, but they were able to work within the military capacity to get a lot of the jobs done that were needed in the backdrop. And these three women have phenomenal stories, especially, well, there's not especially, but with Kalyani Sen, it was very much about the visibility of an Indian woman in uniform in a sari, and looking at the cultural adaptations of uniforms for women who had different cultural beliefs and different cultural reflective visibilities, and her voice being documented for being a symbolism of change at that time throughout India and the need of empowerment of women in particular positions. We have women from the Auxiliary Air Force for the Maori community in New Zealand, and I showed you the Maori pioneers in World War One. We then have the women from the Maori community serving in World War Two. The Women's Army Corps of the 6888, the African Americans coming over for the Central Postal Directory, they were pivotal in establishing order for our mailing services up there in Birmingham, and they had to deal with room filled with millions of letters getting to men on the battlefront as well as their loved ones, and this assisted in developing and building the morale between families and their servicemen. And again, it's morale that kept the men going during the war efforts, you know, receiving that letter, receiving that cake, that pie, all of that connectivity of that relationship building. And it took African American women coming over from America to be able to support with that. They also contributed to style, to tournaments, because they came over and had netball tournaments and football tournaments and beauty pageants and modeling shows, and just brought that aspect of African American culture over to Britain and to Europe, again, that we all are impacted by. African and Caribbean Royal Air Force officers. So I'm not sure if you can pick out the man who was born in Africa, but he's second from the where do I say this? He's second from my right on this side of the screen. He's the only man from the continent of Africa born in Sierra Leone. His name is Johnny Smythe. We have men again born in England, Sidney Cornell born in Portsmouth, and Lewis Tully born in Islington, London. And I hope you remember for World War One, his father served in World War One. He also went on to serve in World War Two. Sidney Cornell is important for many, many reasons. He was a part of Operation Overlord, which is where we have D-Day, but he wasn't there on D-Day. He was there a few days after. He was in the paratrooper regiment. But Sidney Cornell was his character or his presence, his history, we were able to use in developing a World War II game called Vanguard. So the Call of Duty Vanguard used his existence as a framework, and we built a history upon his character to create the first Black protagonist character in the history of their video games at the time, to be able to allow players to have an immersive experience, but also take away factual historical evidence about the time and about the regions that they were learning about, to be able to further educate players in the arenas that they are interested in. We have Emmanuel Thomas and Johnny Smythe from Nigeria also serving in the Royal Air Force. Errol Barrows and Ulrich Ross. So Errol Barrows became the first Prime Minister of Barbados after serving in World War II. Ulrich Ross became a pivotal voice and a pivotal presence in the liberation of Ghana. In 1957, he was a lawyer after the Second World War, but he's also noted to be the most highly decorated RAF, British West Indies RAF officer during the Second World War. Jamaicans, because everywhere we go, we see a Jamaican. We have Arthur Wint, Sam King, and John J. Blair. So John J. Blair served for the Royal Canadian Air Force. Arthur Wint and Sam King served for Britain's Royal Air Force. Sam King became the first Black mayor of Southwark. And also he is one of the founding fathers of the Windrush Foundation and the reason why we know about and why we celebrate Windrush today. And Dr. Arthur Wint, he became Jamaica's first 400-meter winner in the Olympics in the London Olympics 1948. He also became the second High Commissioner of Jamaica, establishing a relationship between Jamaicans in Jamaica and in England, and in England and Jamaica, and being that spokesperson for that relationship building. We have Wainard Panaho from the Maori community in New Zealand, and we have Isilike Dovorata from Fiji, again, both serving in the Royal Air Force. Charles Percy Ashby and Jeff Burns Sr. were both men serving in the 768th Tank Battalion. This tank battalion is significant in history and also in history for the 1960s because the Black Panther Party named themselves after this battalion because their nickname, just like the 369th Infantry was the Harlem Hellfighters, the 761st Tank Battalion was called the Black Panthers, and that's where their name comes from. So again, a lot of things in history have connectivity, we just don't know how to connect them. This is me with World War II veterans from Jamaica, Alan Wilmot and Neil Flanagan. They both served in the Second World War, and it's been a key part of the work that I do to be able to document the voices of those who were there or who are firsthand, who heard it from those who were there. So again, we've been celebrating a lot of anniversaries since 2014 up till now, and being able to have them a part of those celebrations has been very, very important for all generations to be able to see and be able to experience a lot of the feeling and a lot of the memories that can be found from our veterans and those who have served in different capacities. I also went to Ghana, and you have ex-WO1 Joseph Ashite Hammond, who served in the 82nd West Africa Division for the Royal West African Frontier Force, and he saw action in Burma during World War II. So I took him back to Takoradi, which is a port town of where his ship sailed from Takoradi up to Asia, Europe, for him to travel through to Burma and document his memories through that. And I think he was 96 at the time. So this is a team of several generations, 4 generations, to be able to talk about this history through different lenses and to be able to see how important it is for us to understand the people and the choices that they were making and why they made those choices. Sir Leary Constantine, MBE. So he was the first Black Lord in England in the history. And history, just like we talked about Ignatius Sancho being the first Black man to vote, Sir Leary Constantine was the first Black peer in the House of Lords. He served during World War II, and he worked for the Ministry of Labour and National Service as a welfare officer, and his job was to employ West Indians into English factories. He was a famous cricketer, and his contributions led for him to be able to travel throughout the country, but he was being racially discriminated against, and his voice wasn't one that was going to be silent. So he is pivotal to the development of the Race Relations Act of 1965, which was the first to address racial discrimination in this country. So we're looking at the changes of laws and the changes of liberty and relationships here. This has been created by people who have served in a variety of capacities and who chose not to remain silent and to endure injustice that was happening in a place that they were calling their homes. Then we have Queen Elizabeth II. So many men and women have fought under her reign throughout the world. Her reign was very much a part of the global Cold War, which ended in 1991. And then wars that have taken place after. But when we're talking about serving and talking about remembrance, we're talking about a legacy of service. We're talking about remembrance of those who served for us to have our liberties and our freedoms today. There are a few of these artifacts. So I've been curating this for the last, I think, 8 years and looking at the global reach and the global impacts. So in the top left, we have West Africa. In the middle, in the top row we're starting, we have the West Indies. To the right, we have East Africa for the King African Rifles. Just below the West Africans, we have the Americans. So we have the Buffalo Soldiers. So Bob Marley's song about the Buffalo Soldiers from the American Civil War, and then the Blue Helmets. We also have an artifact for the United States County for the Coast Guards, and we have a woman called Olivia Hooker. She's one of the first Black women to serve in the Coast Guard, but she is a descendant of the Tulsa massacre that took place in 1921, where Tulsa was bombed, and the communities were displaced because of the success of the town, due to it being in a very, very provincial area that was very, very affluent. She was a survivor of this, but she went on to serve, went on to further get her education, and became a voice, just like the women I spoke to about in World War II. She was also a pivotal voice around liberation and the remembrance of what had taken place in her home, so that when we get to the presidency of Barack Obama, there was remembrance for this atrocity that had taken place in 1921, but she had also served for her country to be able to liberate herself and her voice. In the centre, just under the West India Regiment, we have the No. 2 Construction Battalion and the Royal Canadian Air Force. To the right, we have the Royal Flying Corps, we have the Royal Air Force and the Women's Auxiliary Air Corps, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and the Auxiliary Territorial Services. To the third row, we have the Fijian Field Artillery, and we have an additional Fiji shoulder plate. In the center, we have the Australian Commonwealth Military Force. To the right, we have the various different nations found in New Zealand. So it wasn't just the Maori communities. We have other communities who had other names, that we have their specifications of their symbolisms also found within these artifacts. And on the bottom row, we have the South African Native Coloured Corps. They had a specific artifact created for them to identify them away from South African white troops. We have the Rhodesian Defence Force, and then we have the Southern Rhodesian and the Zulu communities who served in the Boer War. So these are artifacts for the Boer Wars. In the center, we have the French Foreign Legion, so the kind of leaf. In the center, we have the eagle with the wings expanded for the Schutztruppe, and then we have the lion on the crest for Force Publique for the Belgian Congo. And then the final box, we have the Sudanese Defense Force, and we have the Somalian Scouts. So again, this takes us around the world in 80 days like Phileas Fogg. But this gives us a world view of the contributions made and the artifacts that are available and that have been out there, that may have been passed down through families, that may have been lost, but again, are visible relics of a time past and of contributions and service that have been made by people all over the world. Coming soon, all of this that you have seen and more will be found in a book that I am finishing. I'm trying to finish this year, called Our Ancestors Served, but it's to give you a view of what ancestry looks like from all of our perspectives, because it's not just about being Black or white or Asian or wherever we're coming from. It's about looking at ancestry, it's about looking at service, and it's about looking at the choices that each individual makes to be of service to their family, to their community, and to their nation. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic, Selena. Thank you so much for that. Really interesting. Now, I've got a couple of questions, but we'll hang fire on those. Give people in the audience a chance to post to put their questions in. So remember, if you type into the Q&A box, Amazing overview of the contribution from dating back so far to in terms of service for the from the British Empire. So Malcolm has said, referring back to World War One, where you said a black soldier fired the first shot. Where was it? Well,
it was in Togoland. So at the time it was called Togoland, which was governed by Germany. So the on the continent of Africa and West Africa, the Gold Coast is side by side to Togo, and they're only divided by rivers. And if you go there, it's better. When should you go there? You should go there just before May, because after May you won't be able to get over the river because it floods during that time period through the summer. But I traveled through I've traveled through Africa in both directions to be able to have an idea about, where men were walking from or where they were going to. But the first shot was fired in Togoland because the British didn't want Germany to have access to their telecommunication towers to be able to send information back to Germany. So they had to quell that immediately, and that's where the first shot was fired.
It just seems absolutely extraordinary that the first shot should be fired so far away from the Western Front, which is where you assume that
everything
all started.
Where everything happened, yeah.
But as you say, telecommunications clearly absolutely vital. So thank you.
Can you explain the double-headed eagle badge on the
Oh, yes.
Double-headed. I'm trying to think, do I have it to hand?
Hidden up your sleeve.
Hidden. Here's one I made earlier. It's not double-headed. It has a mini crown. I do have it to hand. It has a mini crown on the top. I'm just going to show you if you can see that.
Wow. Yep, we can see that.
Behind it, so it gives it some clarity. Let's see if we can get some. But I think there's a lot going on. Oh, there we go. Let's see if we can get that. But it's a single head with a crown on the top. And then the coat of arms in the center.
So where does it come from? Which unit?
Germany. So where did I get it from?
Oh no, which military?
The Trooper, which is another term for kind of like a police force, because in Cameroon they didn't have the Trooper, they had a police force, but in German Southeast Africa and German East Africa, they had the Trooper. And they had them alongside the Askari troops as well, and the carriers and their carriers.
Okay, thank you. I've got two burning questions I wanted to ask. The first one is maybe fairly simple. I think the second one might be a little bit more complex, which you highlighted Equiano as he was served on board a ship in the 7 Years' War. Was he still a slave then?
Was.
So did he have any choice?
Right. So
serving, was he sort of conscripted? I think would be a tactful way of putting it.
Well, because his master was aboard the ship, he too was with his master.
I see. So he served with his master.
Yeah.
How interesting. The second question, and I see we've got one from Rosemary, so I'll come back to that in a minute. But I was very struck by the number of the people you talked about who ended up in very senior positions, sort of leading their countries or sort of spearheading independence, and that made me think about what the impact was on those people of essentially the new opportunities they had because they traveled, because they joined the forces. wide range of experience and responsibilities. It must have given them huge sort of range of opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise.
So that's 100% true. And when we look at history and we look at the void of why we don't know this, the baseline was that when you empower people, they continue to be empowered. So when you're empowering people who you have disempowered, there is a worry that they will continue to keep being empowered and re-empowered, and that was not wanted. So there were a lot of laws and a lot of treatments and a lot of frameworks put in place to be able to try and prevent, the rise of Africans or people who were classified as aliens, which are people who are other than, a particular type of bloodline. And this is where, there's eugenics and scientific warfare and a lot of the things that we see in World War II exist, but it exists because of a pre-mandate of what was seen to be visible. But the empowerment of being educated in a language that had been hidden from you. So in a lot of the West African countries, we have pidgin English because it wasn't wanted for Africans to learn English, because then they would understand a lot of the things that they were being lied to, a lot of the things that they were being, I guess, swindled out of, but then to be able to be as an equal, and that's not what was wanted or what was needed at the time. So the education that was being sought after was for that liberalism, therefore that being able to stand toe to toe with your former colonial masters, your former colonial infrastructures, to be able to say, we are able to be free, we are able to do as you do, we are able to govern and look after ourselves. So what had taken place after the First World War and the Second World War, and throughout the intermediary areas of the war, was a meeting called the Pan-African Congress. So one took place in 1919 in France at the same time as the Treaty of Versailles was taking place, to be able to talk about which leaders would be responsible for taking over the German colonies and not affording them to another European nation. And this is where the League of Nations came in, to be able to appoint Britain to be the custodians of the lost regions of Africa that Germany had lost. But the meeting was proposing that leaders of the African world outside of Africa be able to come and work with Africa to be able to show Europeans that we actually can be seen as equals. And the same thing took place after World War II, the Manchester 1945 Pan-African Conference, where we have men such as Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, who we know to be the first prime ministers of Ghana that we know today, the Gold Coast, and Kenya. And they were coming together to talk about these ideas. And we have other meetings that took place from 1900, the Pan-African Conference, led by a Trinidadian called Henry Sylvester Williams. And then we have the Universal Race Conference in London, again in 1911, where W.E.D. Du Bois, and we have Mahatma Gandhi and other men and women coming from Asia, from Oceania, from Africa, from Europe, and from the Americas coming together to again have these conversations. So a lot of these conversations around liberty, around freedom, around emancipation have been happening for a very long time. But what the war did, it allowed for men to stand side by side as brothers on the battlefront, and that started to change the relationship between white Europeans, between Black Africans who again are throughout the world in diaspora, and changing a lot of the mindsets around identity. Because in the West Indies, you are a West Indian irrespective of the race that you are classified as. The same way in the continent of Africa. So it was looking at changing that conversation and changing the nuance on how we work with one another and what we actually need and what we actually want.
Absolutely fascinating to see that continuity. Yeah. Okay. So Rosemary has said, what was Norman Manley studying at Oxford? He only she only knows of him as one of Jamaica's heroes.
So you were studying law.
So was that before? I can't remember. Was that before he did before the
in
war?
1913? Yes. So he was here in 1913 studying law, and when the call came, he and his brother went to sign up whilst they were here in England.
Yeah. But then his war service gave him that sense of that responsibility and the gravitas to then go from there. Yeah.
Because then what you get when you're in universities is you're a part of that alumni, you're part of that, you're now a part of that world. So the access that they have, you have.
And the military service as well.
That's right.
Okay, and Alan has said, with respect to the veterans that you've spoken with, What inspiration do you take from them?
That I too have a part to play in service. So the work that I do with Black Poppy Rose is to ensure that narratives from the past are respected, irrespective of our personal feelings and our opinions, because my perspective is we weren't there at the time. And the same way we make choices today based on being as rational as we think we are on choices that we're making to be able to make a change or say what we feel is unjust. I feel that looking at their service and their understandings of why they came to serve for their country, why they felt it was necessary for them not to sit back and do nothing, that I too do not have that in me to sit back and do nothing when I see the things that can be done can help us all to be able to grow and develop in ways that keep, creating those small drops and those small changes, and then we start to see, much more happen in regards to how truthful we can be about where we see ourselves and how truthful we can become in developing a nation that we say we want to be better. And we are all responsible for that. And I take that responsibility by being inspired by them taking their responsibility.
And you're celebrating also the contribution that people made who come from all over the then British Empire, which in many ways is a hidden or sort of slightly forgotten story, because we remember the sort of they have taken their stories back to where they came from, if they did come back. But of course, then many, I remember the man celebrated in our exhibition, who then returned on the Windrush and sort of brought the celebration of his service back with him when he returned to England.
Well, we're told what to remember. And I think that's the danger in not being able to share as much, is because we're told whatever people know or whatever people want us to understand. And again, I showed you artifacts, I showed you pictures, things like that. It's not that it's not there. It's just that there are narratives that create changes in people's thinkings. And when you change people's thinkings, you cannot control the outputs.
Okay, thank you. And Catherine has asked, was there a good secondary education system in the West Indies?
Right. So there was limited access to education. There was limited access to work. So many men and women and families had to leave the West Indies to seek work for their families. So a lot of them traveled to the Americas and Canada to work on plantations and to work in factories. But what had happened is they started to build families and started to integrate into the African American communities and start working together with them to try and establish this change. So we have after the American Civil War of 1865, we have the growing development of African American communities who are now becoming affluent and developing in education and being given access to schools. So when we get to the 1960s and we see, the first young black girl being protected by white men because of integration, this is a journey that has taken over 100 years to get to, from the 1860s to the 1960s. And the West Indies was predominantly made to be a plantation. So when there wasn't that much work and when there wasn't that much available, men and women had to leave to be able to seek greener pastures, as they would say, to be able to support their families and build a future that they felt they deserved.
And Anne has asked, what do you feel can be done in schools to inform younger people about this important history?
What can be done? We're doing it as we speak, the access to more resources, and it's about, because when we're teaching things, what are we teaching it for? And I think it's very much about revising what is education today? What does it mean to us? What do we want our children to be taken away with them as they go out into the world to become professionals, to be of service in whichever arena that they're in? And it's about looking at the scope as to why we are talking about this and in what way. It's about encouraging young people, because that's who we're educating, to be able to have a connectivity to themselves and to a history and a heritage that exists within them for them to connect with anything external. So when we're teaching about the war and, you know, being a part of the British Empire, not many people have families from the British Empire. How do we include their narratives? And it's about being able to be responsible with what we're sharing and how we're sharing it, and looking at how we're impacted by that today. So schools just need access to more resources and teachers to be trained at the university level and have this information when they are going through their training. So they already have it ready for when they're creating their lesson plan. So it's about finding that balance with new teachers being educated with this information so they have the access and being able to assist schools in accessing resources and lesson plans that meet the needs of their environment and the makeups of their children. So if you have predominantly white dominated schools, why are they not learning about the global impact of the empire with all other students just because they don't have that in their ancestry? The same with predominantly black schools, giving them a global sphere of who was a part of those wars, because they're coming from places where they have ancestors outside of this land, and looking at the relationship between those who don't have access to history outside of this country and allowing them to understand the impact of an empire that they may have never seen, and those who are coming in from an empire and understanding those who have never left, and looking at how history is taught here from that perspective.
Fantastic. And I think that's just so important. It's certainly been an eye-opening talk for me to see the contribution that so many men and women made from right the way across the British Empire. So I think with that, we'll say a huge thank you to Selena for your absolutely fascinating talk. We'll let you go and look after your daughter, see what she's up to. But we'll take a very strong message away, and thank you so much for your talk, and thank you very much. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Oh, and we must remember your book.
Yes, and Black Poppy Rose website. So if you want to order your pins or your wreaths, they'll be ready in the middle part of the year. So we lay them every Remembrance Sunday. So you can, and the idea is to get them to remember them in your constituencies. So then we are able to start talking about things in another way. We wear our pins all year round, and this year we're remembering of many anniversaries. So the idea is to keep the conversation going, because if we're not talking about it, we don't remember it. And there's a lot for us to talk about. There's a lot for us to share. You know, it doesn't matter what you don't know, because you don't know what you can know just by saying one thing or asking one question. So that's, yes.
So Black Poppy Rose website. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.